Kökte ve
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Lemon işlemi oldu internette.
So good afternoon, dear guests, dear participants, and I would like to welcome you everyone for the first event we are going to start in Tashkent State University of Law. And so today our guest speaker, keynote speaker, will be Professor Frank van Splunder. If I made a correct pronunciation of your name.
That's okay. That's okay. Don't worry.
That's okay. And as far as I know, my voice is clear enough and my video is clear enough, right? Am I audible?
Yeah, sure.
So today we are going to start. It's a great pleasure to start our teaching and learning legal English skills week. We used to have like a week series of events in a week, but this year we made some changes and we expanded into 2 weeks, and so that's not going to be a legal English week, but that's going to be a fortnight, I believe. And
Also, I want to mention
we usually invite experts, legal English experts from all over the world, and this year the same too. And we invited very famous experts, and one of them is right here. And so also we have some guest speakers, and overall we invited seven guest keynote speakers, and they will be just giving some expert advice for our students, our participants, and our anyone who would like to join us. And also, as far as I can see, our next speaker, Alison Wheelbeck, who will be joining us, and she will be just having a bit information about how it's going to on. And so I think, well, what's time? So it's 2 p.m. at Tashkent. It's time to start. And first of all, I would like to give a couple of information about our guest speaker. And then we are going to start with the welcoming speech of our head of the department. And then our guest speaker will be giving his expert advice in this event to our students, to our participants. So, dears, today we are going to talk about the English language learning, teaching, and testing in non-English dominant countries. So, as you know, Uzbekistan is non-English dominant country. So our first language and the native language is Uzbek, and the foreign language for us is going to be English. So I can say English is not the dominant in our country. So we'll be talking about this one, and we're going to focus on learning, teaching, and testing, and that's going to be our topic. And as I say, our guest speaker from Belgium and Professor Splunder, Frank van Splunder, will be giving his advice. And so I think I gave enough information about our keynote speaker, and probably Professor Frank, maybe you should give some information about yourself.
Yeah, okay. First of all, I was going to thank you for the invitation. So even though I'm not in Tashkent, but maybe I'll be in Tashkent one other day, who knows? But I read a couple of things about Tashkent. I was really fascinated by just the city and the country, educationally, but also culturally and even linguistically. I thought it was very interesting and really suiting into what I'm doing. So my research is about language and politics. That's a general thing, but my focus is on English as the language of English as the lingua franca, and English as it's being used in higher education. All over the world, but with a specific focus on Europe, and especially Europe in the last couple of decades, I would say. That's all I'm going to say about myself. Over to you. If I don't have to start with the presentation, how's it going to work?
Okay, before the presentation, I would like to give the mic to our head of the department, to Oybek Toshmatov. So he is going to join us. And Mr. Toshmatov, please welcome.
Nimaga ovoz eshitilmayapti bizlarga?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's audible.
Okay. Well, minor things happen in major places too. So, well, I guess my video thing is not properly working, so I'll just try to deliver my speech without being visible to all. So first of all, allow me to thank our guest speakers today. So we all know that the foreign language learning process is a dynamic process. It's developing, it's expanding on every year, and more and more people are switching to learning English these days now. And this is also one good thing about this feature, that people from different parts of the world, different walks of life, can communicate and can come together, primarily thanks to the language first, and then the other technical aspects like Zoom or so. So the language itself is a very unique feature, and we all have this language, but not everybody kind of goes deep into the language itself and does the research on language acquisition and language learning. And the thing we run in Tashkent State University regarding the language teaching is that we primarily focus on delivering classes based on the English for specific purposes area, so we try to teach legal English to our students. So of course, there might be some obstacles and difficulties. Okay, so some obstacles and difficulties we face, but those difficulties basically help us to further improve the delivering the language, teaching languages, and further improve our skills in basically delivering productive classes in our environment, primarily in an environment where English is not the first language. So these kind of events help us to shape the theory of of better improvement in our classes, and also help us to further expand the language teaching realm and further improve our skills in this area as well. So dear professors, Professor Frank van Splunder, I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, and also our guest speakers, now allow me to announce this event as open, and I would give the floor to Mrs. Sardor, and Mrs. Sardor, you can carry on from here on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's time to start our event, and now it's open. And so how we are going to do? First of all, we are going to have the presentation, and that's going to be the main part. And after the main part, we are going to go simple Q&A session, which is going to be question and answers from our audience. And so is it okay for everyone? Seems valid. Seems valid. Okay, great. So now I should give the permission to share the screen. And now, okay, so we can start, dear professor.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to share my screen first. Yeah. Hold on.
It's visible.
It's visible. Okay, perfect. Good. Slideshow start. Yeah. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
So today I'm going to take what I would call a broad view in English. So I'm going to start from, well, how come that English plays such an important part in today's higher education? But I'm also going to focus on one particular issue. So I'm going from broad to very small, and a small thing is a test which I helped to develop in the region I come from. So the title of my presentation is English Language Learning, Teaching and Testing in non-English dominant countries. So non-English dominant, that's the new term which is being used for what was called non-English speaking countries. But then you should realize non-speaking countries, well, all countries are English speaking these days. So it does not really make sense to call them non-English speaking. So non-English dominant is a better term. Right, so before I start, let me introduce three keywords which will be very important in my talk. That is, first of all, obviously English, Englishization, globalization, and localization. So I'll say a bit more about this in a minute, but Englishization and globalization are often confused, even though they're not the same thing. So people often think it's the same, but it's not. I'll explain in a minute. And globalization and localization are often seen as opposites, which is not true either. In fact, they can both go together. Again, I'll explain this in a minute. So let's have a look at English or Englishization first. So I'm not going to give a history class here, but it's important to have a bit of context. So you could start that Englishization started together with colonization, and you think of the British Empire roughly from the 1500s, a bit earlier, could say, to 1900, a bit later until the First World War. You could say, so the gradual colonization of North America, United States today, Asia, and later Africa. This was not, of course, the purpose was not to spread English over the world, but that's what happened as a side effect of colonization. And then, of course, in the 20th century, the British Empire became less important, and lost its importance, in fact, but it was overtaken by the United States, especially after the Second World War. The United States became dominant in the world, especially, of course, the Western world. There are two things I'd like to point out here. First of all, well, you could say this lasted until the divide between East and Western Europe between the between the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is something I remember quite well because I was there at the time, and I remember this the slogan "Test the West." Now, this has nothing to do with language testing, but it was the slogan of a tobacco company, and the idea was that, well, they want to sell their product, of course, but it had also a political meaning. So test the West, go for the West, look at the West instead of looking towards the East. You got this mental political shift from East to West. That's one thing. And another thing is, of course, that test the West was not just a political thing, but it was also a linguistic thing, because this was in English, and it was the first time that English became so important in Eastern Germany and later in Eastern Europe. And it was, of course, the first time that, our publicity became so important in a world which was before that dominated by statues of Lenin and the other important people of the Soviet Empire. And then, of course, another important date, which I just added because it's important for you, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the emergence of all the independent states. And if I got it right, Uzbekistan was also recreated as independent state in 1991, right? Okay, so that's the general political context. Now, another thing for this talk, which is about higher education, is that the Englishization of higher education in Europe was later. So it started, in fact, in 1999, so just around the turn of the century. And there's some irony here, because in fact the idea of Bologna, of as it's called, so in fact it's the Europeanization of higher education. But the idea was that people could go to another country, study in another country, and learn the language of that other country. Now, in reality, what happened was that English became very dominant. So instead of studying in Finnish or Dutch or Danish, well, universities just made available courses in English because of commercial reasons and educational reasons too, because it was very difficult to attract people from other countries if you don't speak English. So that's the reason how it all started. And that's important for my story. You see a divide here between the north of Europe and the south of Europe. So the Englishization was mainly happened in the north of Europe, in the Netherlands and in Scandinavia, but mainly in the Netherlands, where some universities turned to English as the only language of instruction. So in fact, their own language, Dutch, was just discarded almost and replaced by English. There was a lot of protest against this, to the extent that a lawsuit was filed against 2 Dutch universities because they had too much English. Eventually, they lost the universities lost the law case. In the south of Europe, this is less the case, this Englishization. So, and why is this? So let's have a closer look at this. Hold on, I'll do it like this. Okay, yeah. So you see a language shift in Europe. So I made a rough division between the north of Europe, the south and central and east of Europe. And the north of Europe, this is the area where mostly Germanic languages are being spoken. So Germanic languages are languages related to English. Think of Dutch, Danish, Norwegian. So in these countries, the languages are not just related to English, but they also have a very strong tradition of not just English, but of multilingualism. And in fact, the L2, the second language in those countries, was not English in the 19th century, but it was German, French to a lesser extent, and also English. But it all changed, of course, after the Second World War, and English became more dominant. So, for instance, I grew up in the 1970s, and German and French were very much part of my curriculum. Today, this is not the case anymore. So today, it's very much focused on English. And in the south of Europe, you see a similar story. So it's mostly Romance languages which are being spoken. So languages like Spanish or Italian, so languages related to French. So this was not a surprise that French was the main second language until again the 1970s, 1980s, and then it started changing again. And today, most people in Spain and in Italy are more fluent, but relatively more fluent, I would say, in English than in French. Central Europe or Eastern Europe, you see a similar tendency. So they're mostly Slavic languages are being spoken, Central Europe, Polish, Czech, and then you see a very strong German tradition, especially in the western part of Central Europe. So think of the Czech Republic or other countries where a main part of the cultural and intellectual life was in German. Think of writers such as Franz Kafka. So he was Czech, but he wrote in German. And then, of course, Russian became very important when after 1917 with the Russian Revolution, and this lasted until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. So there you see a gradual replacement of, well, German and Russian are being replaced by English these days. And well, the good example is, well, what I'm doing here. So 20 years ago, it would not have been possible. So that's the general picture. Now, let me come back to the other two keywords I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. So Englishization and globalization, so which are often mixed up, but they're not the same thing, because in fact, globalization, you can have globalization without English or without Englishization. Think, for instance, of the former empires of the Soviet Union, China these days, Latin America. This is also kind of globalization without the same amount of English. So it's perfectly possible. On the other hand, it's also possible to have English without globalization. So it's not because you introduce English that you become part of the world. So that's another thing you should remember, of course. Globalization and localization. So it looks like they're opposites, and they are, but they're not at the same time. So in fact, globalization means that you take into account the whole world. Localization is that you look at the local context. And there's even a word which combines the two, and that's globalization. So that means localization plus globalization at the same time. And a good example is the use of English in non-English dominant countries. So what we see is that on the one hand, English is being adopted and so introduced in the curriculum in society, but at the same time it's being adapted, so changed to a certain extent. So for instance, people have different accents. It can go further. So different varieties of English can lead to new norms and to new testing practices. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so whoops, that's wrong. Yeah, okay. So let me have a look at English or Englishization in higher education. So the focus is on Europe, but in fact, you could extend it to all places in the world. So a couple of concepts I'd like to introduce here. So the first concept is English as a lingua franca. So that's the use of English as a common language by speakers who do not speak it as a first language. So the kind of thing we're doing here. Right? And then you have, of course, English medium instruction, or EMI, as it's often called. And then you can make a distinction, between language teaching and learning in English as a second language. So by language teaching, I mean, for instance, EAP, which is English for academic purposes. Think of writing academic papers, or the example has been given already, ESP, English for specific purposes. Think of legal English. This is different from CLIL. So CLIL, which is content and language in a particular language, and language learning in English, for instance. So, for instance, not just teaching legal English, but teaching law in English. So that's a very different thing. And thirdly, English language testing. They should make a distinction between high stakes testing and no testing at all. If you look at the context of language testing, you will see that in some regions, some countries, the stakes are really very high. So there's a lot of testing. Testing can have huge consequences. For instance, lecturers have to take a test before they can teach in English, and if they fail the test, they lose their job. That's possible. Versus no testing at all. That means, well, they're not being tested, and if someone feels confident enough, they can teach in English. That's okay. So you have those two huge you have huge differences between these two extremes, and a lot of things in between. Last but not least, you have so-called international tests, which I mean tests such as IELTS, which is basically British, and TOEFL, which is basically American, versus locally developed tests. And that's a fairly new trend. So, I mean, local tests are not new, but local tests which have been validated internationally, that's a relatively new trend. And the test I'm going to introduce today is a good example of that. It's not the only one. There's a similar project in Denmark, for instance, and in other countries too. Right, so let me introduce this topic, this test case or case study in small. Is there a question? Okay, I'll just continue then. So let me say a couple of things about Belgium or Flanders, which I think you will not know too much about, just to contextualize. So Belgium is a very small country in the west of Europe, bordering the Netherlands in the north, Germany towards the east, Luxembourg, small Luxembourg, also east, and then the south, France, and in fact the west, which is not here, is the UK, but you've got the channel in between. The part in black is Flanders, which is Dutch-speaking like the Netherlands. The part in white is Wallonia, which is French-speaking like France, and a small grey area, that's the German-speaking area close to the German border, and you have some mixed areas. For instance, it's more complicated than this, but that's the main things. Brussels, which is officially a bilingual area, although French is dominating, but in fact, it's a multilingual area. So there are more than 100 languages being spoken in Brussels. But anyway, this is not the history of Belgium today. The only thing you have to remember here is that Belgium is a language-sensitive country because of the languages, and the language. Everything about languages is regulated by law. So again, law comes in very importantly here. So we have very complex language laws, which are based on the principle that every community has its own language. Okay, let's switch to Flanders, where the test was being made. Flanders is the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. It has a large degree of autonomy. For instance, there is a Flemish Ministry of Education. There is no Belgian Ministry of Education. It does not exist. And the government decides on linguistic matters. So there is very much a top-down language policy. So the government decides and universities have to implement the rules. This is very different from, for instance, a country like the Netherlands or Finland, where autonomies have far more autonomy. Why do I say all this? Because it's important to understand the rest of my story, which is the language test. But let me say a couple of things about the law first. It's a top-down language law. So the law says, the law is, first of all, it's about teaching in a language other than the mother tongue. In practice, this means English. It could be any language, but in practice, what you see is that there is only, well, courses can be taught in other languages, but in practice, it's overwhelmingly in English. And that's the other thing the law says. For teaching in English, a C1 level is required. Now, C1 is the advanced level of the CFR, the Common European Framework. This is a very high level, which is often used in academic settings. But that's important. No one really knows why exactly a C1 would be required. It's what I call the copy-paste inquiry. So universities do it because other universities do it, and these universities do it because other universities do it. So it's not it's not based on empirical evidence, it's based on what other universities do. So it's not very academic, you could say. But it's an important requirement, of course. And the law also says that lecturers need official proof of the advanced C1 level. So what does that mean, official proof? Well, it means that lecturers can take any of the international tests which have been approved by the government, for instance, IELTS or TOEFL. But then universities decided to develop their own language tests, so their own test of academic English, which they call the ITASE. And that's what I'm going to concentrate on today, because it's a nice study of what a university can do to develop its own language testing. So you should not see this as a story about a particular region in Europe. It could be anywhere. You could even do it. So, the ITASE was developed by the IUTC, another abbreviation, and IUTC stands for Inter-University Testing Consortium, which is an organization which consists of four Flemish universities. Now, 4 Flemish universities, maybe this sounds only 4, but that's quite a lot if you take into account there's only 5 universities in Flanders. And it's the 4 biggest universities, so it's Antwerp, Brussels, Ghent, and Leuven. And they have some experience with language testing, as they made the first language test they made was a language test for Dutch, the ITNA, and for which the Q mark of the ALTI was observed. Now, this is important. The Q mark is a quality label delivered by ALTI, and ALTI is the Association of Language Teachers in Europe. So it's an important organization. So if you got that Q mark, it means, okay, you have a good international test which answers to international standards. And the idea was to do the same for the ITASE, but then there was a problem. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So at the bottom of the page, you see the print screen of the ITASE. You see the 4 universities involved. And you can also see there are 3 versions of the test, the ITASE for students, the one for lecturers, and one for CLIL teachers. Today, I'm going to talk about the ITASE for lecturers. This was the one which was developed first. And the ITASE for students was developed later, and the most recent test, which was developed last year, is the ITASE for CLIL teachers. So let's have a look at what this ITASE is all about. So the ITASE for lecturers developed in 2012 and put into practice in 2013, so 10 years ago. It's a localized test. A localized test means that it takes into account the Flemish academic context. And, well, you could think, well, why is this relevant? Well, because every country or region has a particular academic culture, academic context. So a Flemish academic context is not the same as the situation in Uzbekistan or in the UK or in Romania. So it's all different contexts, and the ITASE takes into account this particular context, which is not the case for ITASE for IELTS or TOEFL, for instance. Second thing, it's a high stakes test. The C1 level is required, but remember, this is something designed by the government, and it's also a mandatory test, which means there are very few exemptions. So almost everyone teaching in English has to take this test, except if you have, for instance, a PhD from a UK university or something. And this led to a very controversial thing, namely that the test was perceived as something to control. It was even perceived as a political tool of the government. This was not true, but that was the perception. And the media played a very important role in this, but I'm not going to deal with that here. 10 years later, the ITASE appears to be much more accepted, and the attitudes are far more positive. I'll come back to this in a moment too. Okay, so let's have a look at the ITASE in some more details. What is it about? So I'm not going to deal with the process, how it was created. That will be a bit too technical, but I can come back to that later. But basically, the ITASE consists of 3 parts. The first part is a computer test. The computer test tests general academic skills. So it's not specific, but it's something that could be, well, whether you study law or biology, you have the same academic vocabulary and discourse, and that's what's being tested here. So it tests vocabulary and grammar, listening and reading skills. And it can only be taken at those 4 universities for the time being. And then we have the writing test. Now, the writing test is domain specific. For instance, if you study law or biology, it will be very different. So it is related to the participants' areas of research or your teaching experience, for instance, law, biology, whatever. And the assessment is on vocabulary, so specific vocabulary, the grammar, the spelling, and the punctuation, and the coherence of a text. And the last part of the test is the oral test, which is domain specific again. So what it consists of is a presentation task within a teaching context. So you could think of this as a mini lecture, and I'll show an example in a minute. And then there's an argumentation task to be chosen from 2 academic topics, rather general topics, but topics which are relevant for any academic. But let's have a look at the example of the mini lecture. So that's the presentation task, and lectures, you get about 30 minutes to prepare this. So enough time to think, to make notes, and then you can deliver this in the presentation. So give a short presentation, 5 minutes, on the following topic. Pretend you teach an introductory lecture. Explain and illustrate a particular notion, a crucial notion that will play an important role in your course. So in law, you could think of concepts such as, well, separation of powers, common law, federalism, whatever. So something which is really your area of research. And this makes it very different from, for instance, IELTS, where you get a very general task. If you want to know more about this, I can refer to the website of the ITES. Okay, if you make a test, it's important it has international validation, and that's the reason we try to get it assessed by ALTI, the Association of Language Testers in Europe. But this was not possible at that time because back in 2012, the ALTI ordered tests in the official language of a country only. So that was Article 1 of their constitution. And since English is not an official language in Belgium or of Uzbekistan, you could not get the Q mark. This is interesting because somehow English has become an international language, which is owned by everyone, you could say, but at the same time, you see this protectionism. So the English-speaking countries start realizing, okay, well, we have to sort of protect English as our commodity, because if not, the other countries, a region, are going to run away with it. In the meantime, the constitution has changed, but because of the idea that English has become an international language, which is not just the ownership of the UK or the United States anymore. But anyway, back in 2012, it was not possible to have the ITES audited in the same way as the ITNA. So what we did was to invite a panel of international experts to assess the test. And they did this on the standards used by ALTI. So ALTI made a list of 17 standards, 17 requirements every language test should relate to any language test. I'm not going to discuss them here, but if I included the link and you can read them there. So the expert panel checked the ITES on these 17 items, and the outcome was very positive. So they decided that the ITAs had added value compared with commercially available language tests. And the main things that came out was the authenticity principle. So it's really relevant. It's well, really relates to specific context, and the typical task and the language required to perform these tasks effectively. And also they refer to the balance of the 4 skills. So it's not just teaching in English, but also writing, listening, and reading in English in an academic, in a specific academic context. So we were quite happy that we got this very positive report. So in the meantime, the ITAs, we've been working with the ITAs for almost 10 years. And although in the beginning there was quite some negative attitudes because people felt, well, it's something which has been imposed, we don't like to do this, but we have to do it. So the atmosphere was quite negative, but in the meantime, it has changed and people see that it makes sense. And this brings me to the pedagogical implications of testing. That's something relatively new in language teaching and testing. So there is a clear link between, on the one hand, you teach something which is being tested, but it's more than, you do not just teach to the test. That would be wrong. That would be an old attitude. It really makes, the idea is to make sure your English improves, and then you test. So you've got an interesting washback effect between English teaching and testing. And it also leads to lecturers who are more aware of EMI, so English medium instruction. And I just quote one of the lecturers. This was a coincidence. We did not ask anyone to write this, but we got this. It was a coincidence. It was so nice. I'm going to quote it here. So I'm truly grateful for your support and positive vibes. So that's a course participant writing to his language teachers. And he says, the journey was extremely interesting and educational. As I'm strongly motivated, I will definitely continue practicing and learning in English. In addition, passing the C1 level, as required by the government, it has qualified me to teach students from abroad in English, which I'm really looking forward to. So it's very good if you can read those positive things and people realize that it's important to be tested, and that testing can be a positive thing. So that's really crucial, that testing is not being seen as something negative, but as something positive that could just enhance your teaching skills. Right, so I think it's a good idea to have a short comparison between an international versus a local developed test. And of course, I'm going to compare IELTS and ITAS here. So if you look at the organization, the IELTS is British organized, British Australian, whereas the ITAS is developed in Belgium, in Flanders, by the IUTC test center. So it's a very small scale thing compared to the international organization, which IELTS, of course, is. Another different context issue is the context. So IELTS is made in and by and for Anglo-Saxon universities, while ITAS is made for Flemish universities with a very specific academic culture. And English, of course, the use of English is very different. So whereas in Anglo-Saxon universities, English is used as an L1, in Flemish universities is obviously an L2, and that's the case for most universities in Europe, and not just in Europe, also in your region of the world, of course. And another big difference is the focus. So whereas the IELTS focuses on students, and so it's mainly students going to either learn or study in the UK or abroad, but still it assumes that it's students. The ITAS is geared towards lectures, and we have another test for students. So we keep them apart because it's different things. The lecturer obviously is not a student anymore. And the domain is different, of course, like whereas the IELTS is general academic, and if you study law, or biology or ethics or linguistics, you all have to take the same test, whereas the ITAS really focuses on what is important for you. So when you study law, you don't have to answer questions about biology. You don't have to write anything about biology. And also the grading is different. So IELTS has a 1 to 9 scale, and whereas the ITAS is based on the Common European Framework. You can link them, of course, but IELTS is not in the first place geared towards the ITAS, towards the Common European Framework. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up a little. So English, I talked about English language learning, teaching and testing in a non-English dominant countries, and remember that non-English dominant is the new term for non-English speaking, and I refer to this case study, but then again, you should not see this just as a case study, but you should see this as maybe an opportunity for something you can also do. But anyway, what the ITAS did was it made possible collaboration between universities, and that's important because making a test, a professional test is not an easy thing. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it can also take a lot of money. And therefore, it was interesting that universities collaborated. And this is quite unique because often universities do not collaborate. I don't know how it is in Uzbekistan, but in, well, European context, universities are often competitors rather than collaborators. But this was a nice example where universities really collaborated, and together they made something which is relevant for all of them. So it was not just, well, all universities became better in a way. At the same time, it answers to international standards. So it was possible to develop a high quality test based on all the expertise from language testing, which is mainly, I have to admit, from Anglo-Saxon countries, but then geared towards a specific context. And so hence it's also a localized test, which takes into account the specific academic context. Yeah, also it has some important pedagogical implications. So think of the washback effects, which you have. So learning, teaching, and testing are all connected. So you should not, often what you see is you've got a course and then the testing is something separate. No, it's all geared to one another. So they prove one another. And last but not least, I would like to say something about it. Well, decolonization, it's a bit of a fashion word, I know. So the English, of course, colonized the world, or it's the UK and the United States which colonized the world. They sort of imposed their language. But today you can say, well, this is no longer the case. It's not longer just your language, it's also our language. So in fact, English is the language of everyone. So this is the question of the ownership of English. Who owns English? Well, it's everyone, not just the US or the UK. And this is what I call the decolonization of English, or the adoption and the adaptation, which I referred to earlier. So that's the main things I wanted to say today. Now, before I open the Q&A, I might refer to just two texts if you want to know more about Englishization of higher education in Europe. There is a book with the same title, which was published last year, which has chapters on different countries, 20 countries, over 20 countries in Europe. Obviously not Uzbekistan, but you have some countries of the former Soviet Union, for instance, the Baltic states, and I think their story is quite similar to your story. I mean, these gradual change from Russia as the main language towards English, and I think you see some similarities there too. There's also a chapter on Poland and yes, another country within the former Soviet sphere. if you want to know about more, if you want to know more about the ITAs as such, I mean, the more technical things, which I did not deal with today, so how we made the test, well, how we made it, why we made it like this, the choices we made, you can read the article I published with some colleagues from other universities, which again shows this nice collaboration between universities, an article which we published, well, a couple of months ago in the Journal of English Medium Instruction. If you don't find it, I can send PDF copies of the book too, by the way. So that's the main things I was going to tell you today. So let's throw it open to questions now.
Thank you, dear professor, and it was a great pleasure to hear about one test and starting from the very early history till the development and till the end of this presentation. And it was very difficult and very tedious job to develop a test and to implement to entire country. And now time to ask some question about.
I think there is a question in the chat. Okay.
I believe our students can just write down their questions in our chat box if they feel a bit shy. Our speaker, I believe Mirsardar Choriyev, one of my brilliant students, is going to ask a question. Welcome, Mirsardar.
Yeah. Okay.
It was a really interesting lecture from you. Thank you very much. Well, listening to your presentation, I generated 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
My first question deals with the context of globalization of English. You reminded the political context which connected with the colonization of the Western world, of some developing regions of the world by the United Kingdom and the United States. But these days we can see that, in my view, the economical context becomes more actual because taking into account the fact that 70% of world business communicate through the English language. A lot of countries, a lot of companies in those countries have to learn English to develop the economical connections and economical interaction in the sense of business. So would it be fair to say that the development of business, production of goods, and development of science, the technical progress in the Western world now raises a tendency to learn English all over the world rather than political context?
Yeah, but I hope I got it because it was some noise, but I think I got the message. So yes, I would say that in the past it was mainly the political context deciding the use of a language. So basically, for instance, if a war is going on and it's decided, so after the Second World War, for instance, you saw that in Europe, I mean, so German and French were very important languages. After the Second World War, German was finished. They lost the war, yeah? And French gradually became less important, and English became the absolutely dominant language because of political reasons. That's true. But today, and I think that was your point, English has become an economic issue. So it's not, and that's what we see with the whole ELF story. So English as a lingua franca. So English is no longer the language of a particular country, but it's becoming everyone's language. So it's an economic thing. So, and this means, for instance, that it has effects on everything. So the language is changing. You see the norms are changing. So whereas in the past it was very much geared towards the norms of the United Kingdom or the United States, you see that slowly these norms become more international. And for instance, IELTS and TOEFL use a bit of their importance, you could say. Another thing is, of course, if you think of academic writing, there you see that academic writing is still very much geared towards, for instance, American or British usage, so including a particular way of writing, a particular way of writing. So for instance, the way you develop, you write a research paper is very much a Western system, yeah? But this could change too sometime in the future. So what we see is that English is becoming the new Esperanto. We could even say that Esperanto has never managed to become the global language it aimed to become, but English has been able to do this, and even more so. So English becomes, well, separated from its origins, but it's becoming everyone's language. And therefore, I think you could say English is not just the language of the UK, but it's also my language, it's also your language. Is this an answer to your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And my second question concerns the fact that, in my view, we also can notice that there is a commercialization of learning and teaching in English all over the world.
Yeah.
And it sometimes seems to me that people learn English not just to receive an access to some world scientific databases, but just to teach English and earning some money for everyday expenses. So do you think that this aspect contributes to the artificial popularization of English around the world?
Very good point. I agree. Yes, I think so too. It's something I regret, to be honest. So I think, well, it depends on how you see things. So I think it's a good thing that we have a common language. So the idea of Esperanto, so English being the new Esperanto, that's a good thing. But what I don't like is the commercialization. So English becomes the so dominant, and often it's seen as something which is then detrimental to the other languages. So what we see is that people neglect their own language or their own culture, and that's a very negative sign. So for instance, in education, in culture, popular culture, it's all Western culture, all American, US English, which is becoming very dominant. And I think that's the pity, because we lose a lot. I think it's important you try to make sure that you that you also keep well, how should I say that you do not throw away your own language and your own culture, so that you do not just give in to commercialization and that you replace something by English just because it's English. I think it's important that you keep your own language, your own culture, but that you use English as an additional thing to have access to the world. So I regret very much this commercialization of English and of English language learning and teaching, because after all, it's big business. And so if you think of IELTS or TOEFL, this is a big business. These are big companies that make lots and lots of money. There's nothing wrong with that, but you should realize that English has been marketed. It's been commercialized completely. Okay, thank you for this question. I like it a lot. You had a third question, I think.
Yes, I also have one more question, if you allow me.
Yep.
Well, how would you overall estimate the process of the globalization of the English language? Does it harmful for the diversity of the world? And because learning the language and particularly the English language, not also the way of communication, but also the way of thinking and the outlook of somebody changes to the Western, or saying more specifically to the Anglo-Saxon direction. How would you overall estimate this tendency?
Yeah, good point again. So I know there's a lot of concern about the loss of diversity, and you hear these things about English taking over. So sometimes it's compared to a dinosaur, well, killing all the other animals, although eventually the dinosaurs disappeared. But anyway, honestly, I'm not afraid of English, but it depends on how you see it. So again, it's not a matter of either English or the local language. It should be both. So both should be developed. So I think it's important that you develop and you keep your own language, your own culture. But at the same time, you need an international language to access the world. So in the past, this was Russian for you, whether you liked it or not. Today, it's going to be more and more English, but it does not mean, or it should not mean, that you should incorporate everything of English, or that you should just replace your own culture by English. It's sometimes called the McDonaldification of the world. That's something you should avoid, I think. And I think that's perfectly possible. So you should see English as a tool, but not, it should not mean that it should replace everything. So you have your own culture, your very beautiful culture. You should keep this, and you should. English could even be a way to get to know your culture. For instance, the only way I can talk with you is in English, yeah. But we could talk about your culture in English. So it does not mean that you throw away your culture because we talk in English. On the contrary, so English should have this positive tool of connecting to the world, but at the same time, it could be a tool to make your own language even stronger. And that's something which is often forgotten. So I don't believe in these negative stories that it's the end of diversity, etc. And the other thing I should mention is that also the English language is changing. So whereas in the past, it was just, well, English was being imposed with UK English or US English with all the norms. And you see that things are changing. So the norms are not as strict anymore. You see the language is changing, the way of thinking is changing. So and that's a good thing. So I would also be worried if that's something you mentioned briefly, that the way of thinking will change. That we're also going they're also all going to think along Anglo-Saxon lines. That would be wrong. So it's important you keep your own world. I think I made the message clear, right? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Other questions or remarks or?
Yes, I have a question. After adaptation of English in non-English countries, is it possible to switch from Germanic law system to English?
To change from?
From Germanic law, civil law, to common law?
I still didn't get it. From Germanic?
Yes.
Could you elaborate a bit more? I didn't really quite get it.
Is it possible to switch from Germanic law to English law?
Why not? I don't really see the problem. So maybe, so just tell me if I got it wrong, but so I see English as a lingua franca is a variety of it means that the varieties of English are coming together. So it's a new kind of English which is being developed. At the same time, so this means, for instance, that even for people who speak English as a first language, speaking English in an international context could be a challenge. And so people often think, well, yeah, English is easy if you're American or if you're British. Well, that's not really true. This is true in a British or in an American context, but if you go to an international context, it's a challenge for everyone. So I think if you and this holds for other languages too. So I think it's I don't know whether that's the thing you meant with German, but I think, yeah, I think it's a pity that if the world were English only, so we should adapt English as an additional international language. But I think it's also important we try to we do not sever these links to other languages. For instance, German or Russian, in spite of all political issues, of course, but these are languages with a great culture and great languages too. So I think we should be as multilingual as possible. So my argument is not in favor of Englishization, but in favor of multilingualism, with English as the connecting language between those other languages and cultures. I saw another hand somewhere. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I have a question.
Hello.
How we may pass this I taste, if I'm not mistaken, exam.
I beg your pardon?
I taste exam.
Yeah.
How we may pass this exam?
Right. Well, for the time being, it's only possible to do it at the one of the 4 universities in Belgium, and that is because of technical, but reason, but also because we have a very strict protocol. The protocol is very strict, just to rule out fraud. So, for instance, for the time being, it's not possible to take it online, because you never know what happens online. So for the time being, it's only possible to take it in Flanders. So basically, you need this test when you study in Flanders, but it's also accepted by other universities in other countries. But to answer your question, if you say I would like to take the ITAs now, well, for the time being, this is not possible. Yeah, but maybe. Well, 2 things I could say here. Maybe it's time to develop your own tests. And we would be quite willing to help you with that, or to get you started. But I think it's important that you do not just import tests or use tests which are not that relevant for you anymore. So the question should also be, how does it help me? So a test should be more than just a language test. It should help you to become a good teacher or to become a good lawyer or whatever. So that's the problem with most tests. The tests are too much contained and they do not really help you in the real world. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
there is another question.
No, it was a very interesting question, and we have some questions on our chat bot, and I believe I'm going to read word by word in order to not miss any points. And Jamshid Rozboyev is asking, good afternoon, everyone. I have a question. It's common knowledge that United Kingdom was first industrialized and technological advanced country in the world history. From that point, in some way, if any non-English country, such as China, reached out to world dominance, would the language number one over the planet or the English keeps its place because it's common use?
That's a very interesting question. So,
future concern?
Yeah, I'm not concerned about this. In fact, I lived in China for some time in 89, 90, and I taught English there. So because what happened was China was opening to the world as what you see was today happening in former Soviet republics. So what was happening is that all Chinese are learning English. And I don't think they're going to impose Chinese for a couple of reasons. First of all, Chinese is very difficult. It's a very complex writing system. The speaking system is extremely difficult. That's one thing. Another thing is that English is quite common in China these days. So in fact, China has done this already, the adaptation of English. So I think you can be sure in another 10 or 20 years time, so English will be a very common language in China, and well, Chinese will never be a popular language in other countries because it's too complex, it's too difficult, and English is there already. So that's the other thing. It's a very pragmatic thing. It's an economic thing. So you're not going to start with something entirely new. English is available. English is being used already. It's something I saw when I arrived in China in the 1980s, 1989. No one spoke English, no one. And today, almost, well, not everyone, but I mean in academic context, most people can manage in English, and I'm quite sure the same is happening in Uzbekistan right now.
Sure. Most young generation can speak English rather than Russian.
Right, it's a generation thing. It's people your generation, so it's not people my generation. Yeah, true.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
And dear professor, I'd like to ask one of the last questions, I believe, and I would like to ask a book of yours, which is going to be Language is Politics, and here we can see on our screen. And can you give some more information about your book, because it seems like
Yeah, so in this book, the shortest summary of my book is the title, Language is Politics. So I see language as something that is shaped completely by politics. So in my book, I argue that a couple of things. So I discuss the world languages and the world empires, and I look how these languages shape the world. So for instance, I discussed the Englishization of higher education in Europe, but I also discussed the way people use language to convey a message, and that's a positive way of saying. You could also say that the way they manipulate language to manipulate the world, to sell lies. I often refer to George Orwell in this world. So I have I've referred a number of times to the situation in ex-Yugoslavia. where you really see how language is being used to well, mainly to do two things. So either to create new identities, but you could do this in a negative or in a positive way. So, for instance, creating new identities that could be in 1917, the Soviet Union. Today, you see that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you see that the new states are creating new identities, and usually language plays a very important role in this. For instance, the way scripts are being used. From what I got, you have this discussion in Uzbekistan right now, so that the replacement of script, and that's a very much a political decision. So you've seen this in other countries too. For instance, in Turkey, I'm more familiar with this situation. So Turkey was written in the Arabic script, but then Turkey, with the time of Ataturk, it decided to look westwards, so the kind of thing which is happening now in your part of the world, and also to introduce new words and to adopt the Western script. And you see the same thing as in Soviet republics, that the Cyrillic script is being replaced by the Western script. So the politics in the language is everywhere. It's in the writing system. It's in the pronunciation. It's in the grammar. So I give many examples from countries all over the world. It's nice to refer to that book. Thank you.
And if you have some time, we have the last question. I believe Farzona is going to ask a question. She's raising her hand. Farzona, welcome.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Maybe I'm going off topic, so I'd like ask you to excuse me before I ask this question.
Okay.
How much do you think learning English affects the values of other nations? Because we have a specific goal when we learn a language. For example, if we want to study abroad, we can still learn the values of another country while learning a language, foreign language. I mean, even while learning English, our word view grows a lot. Do you think this affects our values as well?
Mm. Yeah, true. I mean, yeah.
That's the question. I mean, what do you think this affects our values as well? I mean, learning a foreign language, how much is affect for us?
I think learning a foreign language, it affects you a lot. So every language is different. So when I learned German, I learned about German culture and about the German world, about German politics. The same with French. So I think this is very important. So language and culture go together to a certain extent, but you should not exaggerate this either. So sometimes people think, well, that if you speak a certain language, you think in a certain way.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure. I think it does play a role, of course, but it's more general than just the language. I think it's also the culture, your religious background, your economic beliefs, because economy is also a belief, and language plays a role in this, but it's not a determining role. I think it's not because you speak German that you have a German mind, or that you're from Uzbekistan that you have an Uzbek mind. It plays a role, but it's not the determining role some people think it plays. So if you've got these theories in the past that the language you speak is the person you are, well, that's a bit too far, I think. But this being said, I still think it's very important you learn foreign languages so that you can. It gives you access to other people and to other minds, and it helps you to understand people, not just understand literally, but also to understand what's in people's minds. And the same with English, by the way. So I think you should make a distinction between English as a lingua franca, so the way we use English now. And English, if you go to the UK to study in the UK, for instance, then you will be you will pick up British culture, English culture, whatever that means, because also in the UK you have so many different cultures and varieties. It's a mosaic, so we have a tendency to make things to make complex things easy. So we think, okay, that's the Soviet Union, and that's Uzbekistan, and Tashkent is like this, and this person is like this. It's a simplification of a complex reality, and we should be careful for that. And I think language can help us to talk about complex things in a very well, not in a complex way, but in a way that helps you to understand things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Farzanov. Thank you for your question, and the professor, thank you for your answer.
Yeah, very good questions. So it was nice talking to you. Yep.
Okay, and I believe our time is a bit limited for the time being, and some students have been sending their question to me in a private chat. But if you have other questions, you can send me, and I believe Professor Frank will be happy to answer this question through the email if you have some time in the distant future. So at the end of our speech, I would like to thanks for everyone who has joined our first event, and Professor Frank. Also, we have another series of this event, teaching and learning legal English skills in upcoming 10 days. And I would like to see you to join us. And I believe I have sent you this schedule to your email. And if you have time, please join us, and our students will be
I will try to join you. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And at the end of our event, on behalf of Tashkent State University of Law, I would like to thank you for your time and dedication, and for your shared experience with our students, with our colleagues, and some of our participants. And we are so fortunate to have you to join us today. Thank you, Professor Frank.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Any last words? Okay,
Thank you.
so it was a great event. Thank you, Professor Frank. See you soon.
Yeah, it was nice talking to you. It was nice. Yeah. Okay.